That morning, the Kentucky earth was so dry that every wheel rolling over it left a long trail of dust, like a scar cut across the sky. Opal Renner stood on her front porch, hands clasped tightly together, watching the county convoy come down the dirt road that for 70 years had known only bicycles, tractors, and barking dogs. 2 white trucks came first, their tires chewing carelessly into the edge of her vegetable rows. A flatbed followed, and last, a dark-windowed sedan, parked at an angle across the gate, as if anyone feared a 72-year-old woman might run. She did not run. Her legs had given up running years ago, and even if they hadn't, she wouldn't have run. You do not run from the land where you buried your husband. The men in uniform stepped down. Papers were read aloud in the flat, even voice of people who have learned not to look into the eyes of those they are about to hurt. Enforcement order, code violations, ruling of the Warren County Court. Opal stood and listened without interrupting. She had never interrupted anyone in her life. Then they began to carry. The dining table came out first, the oak table Harlan had built the first year of their marriage, its surface still bearing a half-moon scorch mark from a pot set down in haste. Then the standing cabinet. Then cardboard boxes into which someone had crammed the belongings of an entire lifetime, unsorted, unsparing. A picture frame slid off a stack and hit the dirt. The glass cracked in 2, the fracture running diagonally across the face of a man in a straw hat, laughing in the middle of a tobacco field. No one bent down to pick it up. When the mattress was carried across the threshold, the mattress on which she had lain listening to rain drum the tin roof for half a century, something inside Opal broke with it. Her knees buckled. She groped for the pump handle to steady herself and missed. Both knees struck the hard-packed earth. The breath rushed out of her chest and would not come back. The tears arrived without warning, flooding, uncontrollable, out loud. That was the thing she hated most, not losing the house, but weeping in front of strangers. And at exactly that moment, from the southern horizon, a low, thick sound came rolling in. At first like dry thunder, then clearer, denser, until it became the sound of rotor blades tearing the air. Every head in the yard tilted up. But to understand why a helicopter would fly straight toward a doomed vegetable farm at the end of Pemberton Ridge Road, we have to go back 22 years, to one parched September afternoon, when a boy thin as kindling stepped out of the tree line behind Opal Renner's farm. The Renner farm sat at the very end of the dirt road, where the paved surface of Warren County gave up and surrendered to gravel. Once these hills had all been tobacco country. Every harvest season, sheets of golden leaf stretched from one hillside to the next, and the tall, gangly curing barns stood like the towers of a religion that has since died out. Tobacco faded with its era, taking half the county's families down with it. But Harlan Renner, before he died, had managed to do something most of his neighbors called foolish. He tore out every last tobacco plant and converted the whole farm to vegetables. The land's not to blame, he told his wife the night he decided. Only the thing we make it feed has to change. He died of a heart attack among the tomato rows one June morning, just as the first fruit was beginning to blush. Opal found him lying on his side between 2 rows, one hand still loosely holding a fistful of weeds he'd just pulled. From that day on, she worked alone. The fences leaned a little more with each season. The barn roof sagged in the middle like an old spine. But the vegetable rows stayed dead straight and the soil stayed alive, because Opal Renner would not permit it to die. That September afternoon, hauling a bucket of water from the pump, she saw something move at the eastern tree line. Not a deer, too slow. Not a stray dog, too hesitant. Any hungry animal takes risks. Only a hungry human is reckless and frightened at the same time. She set the bucket down and waited. A boy stepped out of the trees. 10 years old, maybe more. Hunger makes children look younger than they are. Thin arms hung slack at his sides. His plaid shirt had stiffened with days of dried sweat. His sneakers were split open at both sides, and through the left split she could see a bare toe, no sock. He didn't run when he saw her. He just stood there, eyes sweeping the yard, the barn door, the tree, the road, as if pre-calculating 3 escape routes for a chase that hadn't started yet. "What are you doing on my land?" Opal asked. Her voice wasn't harsh, but it wasn't soft either. It was the voice of someone who wanted a true answer. "I'm not stealing," the boy said instantly, so fast it was obvious he'd had to say this sentence many times in his life. "I just got lost." She looked at him a while longer, fingernails black with grime, lips pale and dry, cracked at the corners, cheeks hollowed in a way no child that age should have. Hunger reveals itself in small details like these, and once you have seen it enough times, you cannot mistake it for anything else. Opal had been born in the years when these whole hills went hungry. She had seen hunger on her brothers' and sisters' faces, in the mirror, at church. She knew. "What's your name?" The boy hesitated, as if weighing whether a name was something that could be used against him. "Silas," he said at last. "Silas Crane." "Where'd you come from, Silas Crane?" He didn't answer with words. He just raised an arm and pointed toward the road, toward town, toward the highway, toward everything that lay behind him, and said, "Anywhere, long as it's not there." There are answers a wise questioner does not dig beneath. Opal gave a single nod, told him to go sit on the porch and wait, and went back to finish her work. She watered the last 2 rows, washed her hands at the pump, and when she came up the porch steps, she set an enamel tin plate in front of the boy. Stewed beans and cornbread. Nothing fancy. Nothing in this house had ever been fancy. Silas looked at the plate, then at her, as if waiting for a trap to spring. Then he ate. He ate the way a person eats who believes the food will vanish if he slows down, hunched over, one arm curled around the plate, eyes flicking up now and then to keep watch. Halfway through, he suddenly realized she was watching, and he froze, apologizing with his mouth still full of cornbread, his ears flushing red. "Eat," she said. "Nobody here is going to take it from you." He cleaned the plate, wiping it with the last piece of bread. She ladled more. He cleaned that, too. "Are you sick?" she asked. He shook his head, then hesitated. "Sometimes." That night he slept on a wool blanket folded in quarters, laid on the wooden floor beside the stove, the warmest spot in the house. Opal lay in her room, listening to the sound of another human being breathing under her roof for the first time in 3 years, and found it so strange that sleep was long in coming. The next morning, he was still there. He had woken before her, folded the blanket into a neat square, and was standing awkwardly in the middle of the kitchen, unsure whether he was allowed to touch anything. By the 3rd day, he had stopped asking when he would have to leave. Opal never told him he could stay. She simply began handing him small jobs. "Carry this to the barn. Hold this line straight. Sit there and watch the pot." And so, without a single declaration, a lost boy became part of the farm, in exactly the way most of the important things in life happen, quietly, and without anyone saying its name out loud. Silas's story did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments over many months, usually at night, when darkness makes words easier to let out. The first piece came on a rainy evening while the 2 of them sat up late shucking corn. His mother's name was Ruth. His mother used to sing while she cooked, old songs off the radio, and she died of kidney disease when he was 7, after 2 years of the family selling things off one by one to pay the hospital. "Mom kept getting thinner," Silas said, hands still shucking in steady rhythm, eyes never leaving the ear of corn. By the end, she was so light my dad could carry her the way he used to carry me. The second piece came in winter. His father's name was Nathan Crane. His father drove long-haul freight, and his father was the son of a very rich man. How rich, Silas couldn't picture, because he had never once met his grandfather. He only knew that long ago, when his dad married his mom, a waitress at a truck stop diner, no family standing, no dowry, his grandfather had said one sentence that his dad repeated only a single time in his life, on a night when his dad drank more than usual. "Walk out that door, and don't you ever show your face here again. You or any children you have." And his dad had walked out. Nathan Crane died in a rig rollover on the interstate 3 years after his wife, leaving behind a 10-year-old son and not one relative willing to claim him. The third piece, the last, Opal never heard in full. The state placed Silas with a temporary foster family in the next county over. He stayed 8 months before running away. He never told what happened in those 8 months. He said exactly one sentence about it, one night when he thought she was already asleep. "There, I was just a walking welfare check. They took the state's money to feed me, and they counted every bite I ate to make sure they weren't losing on the deal." Opal lay in her room, hearing that sentence come through the plank wall, and she never asked about it again. But from the next day on, she dropped her habit of measuring out portions in front of him. There are wounds whose only proper dressing is to pretend you do not see them. Silas learned the farm by watching, in the manner of children who have learned that asking too many questions is a dangerous luxury. Opal rose at 5, he rose at 5. She stopped to study the sky, he stood and waited, looking where she looked. Then, gradually, she began to teach. She taught him to rinse beans so the grit settled to the bottom, to scoop up a handful of soil and smell whether the earth was still strong or growing tired. Strong dirt smells like rain, tired dirt smells like dust. To read the birds lifting suddenly off the tree line and know whether the wind was turning or rain was coming, and from which direction. To tell a healthy tractor engine from a dying one by ear alone. To be silent when the person beside you was grieving. He listened more than he spoke. That pleased her more than anything else could have. In the spring of the second year, the two of them planted a young pecan tree at the corner of the yard beside the barn. "This kind grows slow," she told him. "Planting a pecan is planting for 20 years from now." Silas asked how old he'd be in 20 years. She did the arithmetic and laughed out loud. "Past 30, older than the tree." Food was always short. Not starving short, but short enough that every meal was a calculation. Opal stretched the bean pot with water and quietly cut her own portion of meat without announcing it. Silas noticed immediately. Poor children are born accountants. He began pretending to be full early, leaving half a slice of bread on his plate with the excuse that he was tired of it, so she would finish it. When she caught on to the trick, she scolded him exactly once. "Nobody in this house goes without for anybody." And then let it be, because she knew she was doing the very same thing. Survival writes its own rules, and the first rule is this: when two people are both going without, neither one is allowed to expose the other. The county education office found them after a year. A woman in office shoes that sank into the soft earth, carrying a folder of forms, asking pre-printed questions. "What is this boy's relationship to you? Where are his papers? Are you aware that harboring a minor outside the system is a violation?" Opal answered evenly, declared what she could declare, signed what she could sign, and asked the pastor of her church to vouch for her character. In the end, after months of paperwork, she became the temporary legal guardian of Silas Crane, a status as fragile as the paper it was printed on, revocable at any moment by anyone with blood ties and a lawyer. Silas went to school in town. His shoes wore out faster than she could earn the money to replace them. At night, under an oil lamp to save electricity, Opal sat stitching his shoe soles back together, her fingers stiff with arthritis, the needle now and then biting into skin so calloused she no longer felt pain, only saw a small bead of blood well up, which she wiped on her apron before stitching on. The winter Silas turned 12, he fell deathly ill. The fever burned through him for 4 days and 4 nights. He lay on the mattress they had dragged close to the stove, his body swinging between coal hot and stone cold, mumbling deliriously for his mother. The pickup truck had had a broken fuel pump for a month with no money to fix it. On the second night, when the last of the fever medicine in the house ran out, Opal opened the wooden chest under her bed and took out Harlan's welding kit. The tool set she had kept untouched for 10 years, the last thing that still held the warmth of his hands. The next morning, she carried it to town and sold it, then walked nearly 5 miles to the pharmacy and 5 miles back into a January wind. On the 4th night, the fever broke. Silas lay facing the wall, wrung out, and in the darkness she heard him whisper, his voice in shreds. "Ma'am? I'm here. When I'm rich, I'm going to pay you back. All of it. I promise." Opal sat down on the edge of the mattress, laid her hand on his forehead, cool now, and smiled in the dark. A tired smile, but a real one. "You worry about getting well," she said. "Life collects its debts in its own good time." She did not know then how true that sentence would turn out to be, or in what manner no one could ever have predicted. People in the county talked, of course. At the general store, in the church parking lot, at the gas station register. Some said Opal was kind. More said she was a fool. "Raising some stranger's boy," one woman at church said, loud enough to be heard. "He'll grow up and walk off, and what'll she have to show for it? Blood kin barely stays these days, let alone that." Not one of the people doing the talking ever offered a sack of fertilizer or an afternoon mending fence. Opal learned to read the meaning inside pauses, inside smiles that never reached the eyes, inside every "you call if you need anything" that came without a phone number attached. She argued with no one. She simply kept working. At her age, a person understands that the best answer to gossip is a straight row of vegetables. Among the neighbors, only Lorraine Petty from the next farm over still came around with a whole heart. Lorraine had been widowed the same year as Opal, and there had been a time the two women were close as sisters, trading labor at harvest, splitting seed, sitting on each other's porches, drinking iced tea on Sunday afternoons. Lorraine still brought over a jar of strawberry preserves or a dozen eggs now and then. Lorraine loved Opal truly. But Lorraine was also the kind of person whose goodness always stopped precisely at the border of inconvenience. She would give you the jar of preserves, but she would not stand beside you when standing beside you carried a price. "You've got to think of yourself, Opal," Lorraine liked to say, whenever the conversation touched the boy, the farm, the future. "You've got to think of yourself." Years later, in these hills, that sentence would slowly change its meaning. Think of yourself would become the polite way of saying 3 words. Sell the land. Silas was 15 when the black sedan appeared. It was a Saturday afternoon in October, the sky so clear you could count the hawks circling the ridge. The car crept up the dirt road like a foreign animal unaccustomed to the terrain, primly avoiding each pothole, and stopped at the gate. Silas was carrying a sack of fertilizer from the barn when he saw it. The sack slipped off his shoulder and hit the ground with a thud. The man who stepped out of the back seat was old, straight as a ruler, silver hair combed back, gray eyes, cold and sharp. The suit on his body was worth more than the pickup truck and the tractor combined. Behind him came a younger man carrying a leather briefcase, the kind of man you could identify as a lawyer just by how he carried the briefcase. Opal came out of the vegetable garden, dirt still on her hands. She looked at the old man, then at Silas, and saw the boy's face gone white as paper. "That's my grandfather," Silas said, his voice so small the wind nearly took it. He had never met the man, but he had seen a photograph, the single photo his father kept in his wallet, taken when his father was a boy. And more than that, he recognized the eyes. They were his father's eyes, set into a face that held none of his father's gentleness. Edmund Crane, founder of Crane Freight, a chain of trucking and warehousing companies spread across Kentucky, Tennessee, and Ohio. The man who had disowned his only son over a marriage that was beneath the family, who had stayed silent when that son died, who had stayed silent again while his own flesh and blood grandson drifted through the state foster system. And now, after 5 full years of knowing exactly where the boy was, because men like Edmund Crane are never unaware, he stood at the gate of the Renner farm with a lawyer at his side and a prepared phrase on his lips: correcting a mistake. Much later, years later, Opal would piece together the real reason. That summer, Edmund Crane had suffered a minor stroke. 3 days in a hospital bed, staring at a white ceiling, and for the first time in 70 years, he had seen his own death clearly, and seen his empire falling into the hands of people who shared none of his blood. Men like Edmund Crane do not go looking for grandsons. They go looking for heirs. Those are 2 very different errands, however identical they appear from the outside. The conversation took place on the porch and lasted a full hour. The lawyer did most of the talking, in words sanded perfectly smooth: priority rights of direct kin, the lost years, a suitable developmental environment, private preparatory school in Louisville, an educational trust, university. Edmund himself spoke only a few sentences, but each one came down on the table like a chess piece placed 10 moves in advance. Opal sat and listened without interrupting. She looked down at her own 2 hands resting on her knees, calloused fingers, swollen knuckles, garden dirt still in the creases. Then up at Edmund's hand lying on the armrest, white, clean, wearing a thin watch. And she understood something simple to the point of cruelty. In this negotiation, she had nothing to set on the scale. She had love. But love does not pay university tuition, does not open the doors that a family name like Crane opens, does not give the boy, bright as he was, iron-willed as he was, the future he deserved. If she kept him, she would win, and Silas would lose. That evening, after the black car departed with a promise to return in 3 days, the 2 of them sat down to supper, stewed beans and cornbread. Neither of them had deliberately chosen the menu of that first day. She cooked it because it was all that was left in the house. But life closes its own circles from time to time, without asking anyone's opinion. Silas didn't eat. He sat staring at the plate like a man staring at an old photograph. "I'm not going," he said. "Silas, I'm not going." His voice cracked, 15 years old, half boy and half man, and both halves shaking. "He let my dad die. He knew I was in foster care and never came. Now he needs somebody to carry the name, so here he is. Tell me to stay. You just have to say it once. One sentence and I'll stay." Opal set her fork down. In the course of her long life, she had done many hard things. Buried her parents, buried her husband, plowed this land through drought and flood. But this moment, the moment of pushing away with her own hands the one thing that still made this house warm, was the hardest. Because the boy was right. She needed only one sentence. And the selfish part of her, the part that was an old woman alone, afraid of an empty house, was screaming at her to say it. She did not say that sentence. She said a different one. "You listen to me," she said, slow, each word set down separately. "What kind of man your grandfather is, I won't argue with you. Maybe he's come for his own sake and not yours. But a door doesn't ask whether the person opening it is good or bad. It only opens or it doesn't. I could give you food and clothes and a straight back to stand on. But I can't give you what you deserve. I've watched you learn, Silas. I know that head of yours holds things this whole county isn't big enough to keep. A door like this opens once in a lifetime. If you don't walk through it because of me, then 10 years from now, 20 years from now, every time your life feels small, you'll look at me and think, what if? You won't say it out loud, but you'll think it. And I would rather be dead than live as your what if." Silas cried. He tried not to, and the trying made it worse. 3 days later, on the morning the black car returned, Silas did 2 things. The first, he set his old shoes, the shoes whose soles she had stitched more times than either of them could count, the shoes he had now outgrown, neatly beside the stove, in the exact spot where the folded blanket had lain that first night. "I'm leaving them here," he said, not looking at her, because looking would make speaking impossible. "So you'll know I'm coming back for them. People don't abandon their own shoes." The second thing was hers. Opal pressed into his hand a piece of paper folded in 4. On it, in the slanted script of people who learned their letters by tracing, she had written, "Opal Renner, end of Pemberton Ridge Road, Warren County, Kentucky." "Just in case," she said. 3 words, nothing more. Silas hugged her. His thin arms shook, and she felt a warm patch spread on the shoulder of her dress. "I won't forget," he said into her shoulder. "I promise. I promise." "I know," she said. "Go on now. And don't look back. You look back and I'll scold you." He did not look back. It was the only instruction of hers he managed to obey that day. The black car rolled away, the dust rose and settled, and the silence came down on the Renner farm. A thick silence, a silence with weight, the kind of silence in which, for weeks afterward, Opal kept catching herself cooking 1 extra portion, setting 1 extra plate, then standing very still and looking at it for a while, before putting it away. People like to picture 20 years of separation as an empty space, but I suspect it is more like 2 ropes running parallel, each one tying its own knots, and neither rope knowing what the other is tying, until the day someone picks up both ropes and lays them side by side. In the early years, there were letters. Silas wrote faithfully, 1 letter a month, his slanted, clumsy handwriting describing the private school in Louisville where the boys wore uniforms with crests, the subjects he had never heard of before, like Latin and microeconomics, and how he missed the smell of stewed beans and could not swallow the beans in the cafeteria because they cook beans there like they're punishing the beans. Opal wrote back, telling him about the crops, about the old dog Biscuit who had lately taken to sleeping in the exact spot where the folded blanket used to lie by the stove, about the pecan tree the two of them had planted, now taller than the barn roof. "Come home and see it. It's growing faster than you." Then Silas's letters thinned. 1 every 3 months. Then every 6. Then the last one arrived in the spring of his 17th year. A short letter, oddly worded, stiff and formal, like something written under someone's eye. Then nothing. Opal kept writing for a while longer. Letters went out and dropped into silence. She told herself, he's busy with school. He's growing up. Children are like that. She told herself everything except the one thing she feared most, that maybe the women at church had been right. Raise a stranger's boy, and one day he walks off, and what do you have? But every evening, passing the stove, she still glanced once at the old shoes, and she did not put them away. Once, Lorraine came over, saw them, and asked why on earth she kept a pair of broken-down shoes cluttering the kitchen. Opal only answered, "Somebody told me to keep them there till he comes back for them." Lorraine looked at her with the expression people reserve for innocent faiths, and asked no more. Time did its work. Biscuit died in the winter of the 8th year, old and peacefully, on the very blanket by the stove. Opal buried him beneath the pecan tree, and that was the second time in her life she wept alone in the middle of the yard. And then the hills began to change hands. First it was rumor, then unfamiliar cars driving slowly along Pemberton Ridge Road, passengers pointing out the windows, then men in spotless shoes knocking on doors. A logistics corporation called Meridian Freight Systems, by one of fate's crueler ironies, the mortal rival of Crane Freight itself, had chosen these old tobacco hills as the site of the largest freight transfer hub in the state. 400 acres of warehouses, truck bays, and a rail spur. The numbers they offered sounded generous, but Opal had lived long enough to know the difference between an offer and an ultimatum wearing an offer's clothes. The neighbors sold, one after another. The Whitmores went first, then the Dosses, then the Pettys. Lorraine came over to say goodbye on a Saturday afternoon, a final jar of strawberry preserves in her hands, her eyes unable to hold a straight line. "They're paying good money, Opal, and we're old now. My daughter in Nashville keeps after me." She paused, then added the familiar sentence which this time sounded like an apology in disguise. "You ought to think of yourself, too." "I am thinking of myself," Opal replied, without heat. "It's just that myself happens to be buried in this dirt. Harlan's in this dirt, too. Where would you have me carry them?" Lorraine had no answer for that. The two women shared one awkward embrace, and that was the last time they spoke for many years. The old fields disappeared behind sheet metal fencing. Bulldozers growled day and night, and on the master plan pinned up at the county office, the entire ridge had been shaded industrial gray, except for one small rectangle sitting squarely astride the project's main internal road, like a bone lodged in a throat. Parcel 17B. The Renner Farm. What Opal never knew through all those years of checking an empty mailbox was what had happened to the letters. Edmund Crane was not cruel in the loud way. He was cruel in the way of an accountant, quiet, systematic, and always in the name of efficiency. In his eyes, the farm woman in Kentucky was an emotional liability to be written off his grandson's balance sheet. "The woman has served her purpose," he told Silas, exactly once, when the 16-year-old asked permission to visit the farm over the summer. "Cling to the past and you will always be a charity boy. I do not fund charity boys. I fund a successor." The request was denied. The letters Silas wrote were handled by his grandfather's private secretary, fed into a document shredder. The letters arriving from Kentucky were intercepted in the estate's mailroom. The final letter Silas managed to send, the strange, stiff one from his 17th year, was written under his grandfather's direct review. And after that, he stopped writing, because he would rather stay silent than send words that were not his own. He told himself, "Wait until I'm 18. Wait until I'm free." But at 18, he discovered that freedom was something his grandfather dispensed $1 at a time. College, the old man's money. Housing, the old man's house. Holidays, the old man's calendar to approve. Edmund Crane bound his grandson not with chains, but with favors, the kind of binding that tightens the more you struggle, because struggling against a favor makes you look ungrateful. And by the time Silas truly did break free, graduated, employed, hurled by his own grandfather down to the lowest floor of the company to learn from the bottom up, drawing a warehouse hand's wages like every other warehouse hand, something else had grown up in place of the old man's fence. Something subtler, something entirely his own. Shame. Because Silas remembered his promise word for word. "When I'm rich, I'm going to pay you back. All of it." At 25, he was not rich. He was a warehouse shift supervisor living in a rented apartment. Go back now? Go back empty-handed, after all those years of silence? To say what? "I haven't accomplished anything, but I came to see you?" His pride, the pride of a child who had once been a walking welfare check, could not swallow that sentence. He told himself, "Wait a little longer. Wait until I can return not with a bouquet of flowers and an apology, but with a repayment worthy of everything she gave." At 30, he was a regional director, still not worthy. At 33, his grandfather died. A second stroke in the middle of a board meeting. Precisely the death the old man would have chosen had he been given the choice. Before dying, Edmund Crane apologized to no one for anything. He simply left the whole of Crane Freight to his only grandson, along with a one-page letter of which the only sentence Silas would remember was this: "You are more like me than you think. That is both the largest inheritance I leave you and the thing you will have to cure yourself of." The next 3 years swallowed Silas whole in the war to keep the company, aging vice presidents who wanted to carve the empire up and sell it, meetings that ran through the night, a marketplace with no room in it for nostalgia. He won. He rebuilt Crane Freight into Crane Logistics and drove it to a height his grandfather had never reached. The trade press called him the heir who shed his skin. And in his wallet, through every one of those years, the paper folded in 4 stayed in the innermost slot. It had worn soft from being opened thousands of times, on nights in unfamiliar hotels, on evenings when he picked up the phone to call directory assistance for Warren County and set it down again, on drives past highway signs reading Kentucky, while his hands tightened on the wheel. The creases had worn into white threads. The slanted handwriting had blurred, but could still be read. That is pride's most sophisticated trap. It convinces a person to postpone gratitude while waiting for a more perfect version of themselves. You believe you are saving up for a homecoming that will finally be worthy. In truth, you are only compounding the days of your absence. The man assigned to pry parcel 17B out of the project's throat was named Dwight Kessler, building inspector for Warren County, 54 years old. This story would be far easier to tell if Dwight Kessler were simply a villain, a greedy man smirking as he counted his money. But he was not. He did not believe he was a bad man. And that is the most frightening part of this entire story. Dwight had grown up on these same hills, less than 6 miles from the Renner farm, in a tobacco family. He was 16 when the tobacco industry began to collapse, and he spent 10 long years of his youth, riding shotgun in a pickup truck, watching his father die by degrees along with the land. Old man Kessler had refused every offer to buy, round after round, each time with the same sentence: "This land's been Kessler land 4 generations." He borrowed to plant the next crop. The crop lost money. He borrowed again. By the time he died, liver, liquor, and a third thing the doctor didn't write on the certificate, but the whole family knew was called despair. The bank took the house too. Dwight, 26 years old, drove his mother to live with her sister, a 4-hour drive during which mother and son did not exchange a single word. From that day forward, Dwight Kessler carried a conviction poured like reinforced concrete. Land is not for loving. Land is for getting out of at the right time. People who clung to land, in his eyes, were not steadfast. They were selfish people dressed in the costume of loyalty, hugging their private past while dragging their families and whole communities down with them. If 30 years ago someone, anyone, had been hard enough to force his father's hands open, his mother would not have grown old in a borrowed room, and his father might still be alive. He tested into county civil service, climbed to building inspector, and worked 20 years without a single blemish on his record. People said Kessler was strict but fair. So when the men from Meridian Freight Systems took him to dinner and raised the subject, accompanied by a planning consultancy fee routed through a shell company, enough to put his only daughter through medical school without borrowing a cent, Dwight Kessler did not feel himself stepping over a line. He felt himself correcting history. The old Renner woman, in his mind, was his own father come back in another body. One stubborn holdout hugging 30 acres and blocking a project worth 1,000 jobs, a woman who would die in debt and solitude unless someone compelled her to let go, for her own good. A human being can persuade himself of anything, so long as the belief permits him to do the wrong thing and still sleep at night. The technical part was simple for a man 20 years in the trade. A few inspection reports with duplicated signatures, among them the signature of the chief engineer who had retired. A few inspection dates backfilled onto days the county office had been closed. Who audits a calendar? A violations file thickening at a steady pace. Barn fails structural safety code. Electrical system out of compliance. Land use inconsistent with Zoning Amendment 7C. That Amendment 7C, in point of fact, was only a proposal, drafted by Kessler's own office, and never once brought to a county commission vote. But who would check? Where would the old woman find a lawyer? Warning letters went out. then a summons, then a hearing at which Opal sat alone at the respondents' table, listening to words fly over her head like a foreign language, and a ruling that took 7 minutes to read. In town, people said she should have sold at the start, that fighting was pointless, that times were times. Opal went on planting. That spring she put in all 30 rows, though the enforcement date had already been set. Lorraine, hearing the news all the way in Nashville, telephoned, her voice full of tears and helplessness, begging her to take the meager settlement and be done. Opal thanked her, hung up, and went out to water the vegetables. The enforcement date was circled in red pen on the calendar hanging in the kitchen. Every night she stood looking at that red circle for a long while. Then she turned off the light, and every morning she went back out to the field, because vegetables do not concern themselves with the calendars of courts. And beside the stove, the old stitched sole shoes sat squarely in their place. 20 years, and they had never moved more than a hand's width. That same week, 600 miles north of Bowling Green, in a conference room on the 31st floor of the Crane Logistics Tower in Chicago, Silas Crane was chairing the most important meeting of his tenure. Meridian Freight Systems, the blood rival his grandfather had fought for 30 years, was dying. Overextended, over-leveraged, and a massive Kentucky transfer hub project running 50% over budget had snapped the company's financial spine. Crane Logistics stood before a once-in-a-century opening, acquiring Meridian's entire project portfolio at liquidation prices. Silas's chief legal counsel, Colette Barr, a woman with tightly pinned blonde hair, famous across the company for never in her career having missed a footnote in any contract, was presenting page 47 of the due diligence report. "The Kentucky project is fundamentally clean," she said, "with one outstanding issue. A single parcel sits astride the main internal road, not yet cleared. Meridian is resolving it through county enforcement proceedings, but my team red-flagged that file 3 days ago because the legal sequence has several inconsistencies. If we complete the acquisition while the enforcement file is defective, the liability transfers to us." "Which parcel?" Silas asked, eyes still moving across a different document, pen mid-signature. "Parcel 17B, Colette turned the page. "End of Pemberton Ridge Road, Warren County." Silas Crane's pen stopped in the middle of his own signature. The nib pressed into the paper long enough for the ink to bloom into a small, round stain. Pemberton Ridge. None of the 14 people in that conference room understood why their chairman slowly set down his pen, drew a leather wallet from the inside pocket of his jacket, and removed from its innermost slot a piece of paper folded in 4, worn so soft it looked like a scrap of cloth. He did not open it right away. He held it in his palm for a moment, the way one holds a fragile thing. Then he opened it, carefully, along creases worn into white thread, laid it beside the report page, and compared 2 lines of address. "What is the name of the parcel's owner?" he asked. His voice made the person pouring water at the end of the room stop pouring. Colette ran her finger down the page. "Renner, Opal Renner, female, 72, widowed, living alone on the property. Meridian's file annotates her as a prolonged non-cooperative subject." Silas Crane rose to his feet in the middle of his own meeting. The leather chair shot backward on its casters. "When is the enforcement order executed?" Colette flipped rapidly to the appendix, and the people sitting nearest watched her face change color before she spoke. "Per the county court schedule," she looked up. "This morning. Sir, they're executing it this morning." Silas was already halfway across the room. "Cancel everything on today's calendar. Call the heliport. Colette, bring the full red flag file on 17B. You're coming with me. And get our Louisville firm on the phone. Tell them to prepare an emergency motion to stay enforcement. I'll dictate the particulars in the air." "Sir," Someone on the board spoke up. "The Meridian transaction still has 3 open points. The transaction will wait." Silas stood in the doorway, and for 1 second, the 14 people in that room saw on their chairman's face an expression none of them had ever seen. Something that lived halfway between terror and prayer. "There is a 20-year-old debt that comes due this morning. That one doesn't wait." And so we return to that dust-choked morning on Pemberton Ridge Road. Opal knelt on the dry earth, both hands clawed into the topsoil as though she could hold 30 acres in place with the strength of 10 old fingers. Deputy Buck Trammell, a broad-built man who was not, in truth, cruel, merely the kind of man who believes that if the paperwork is right, then what he is doing is right, stood beside her in an agony of awkwardness, repeating, "Ma'am, you need to clear the work area," softer and softer each time, because even his own ears were beginning to hear how meaningless the words were. Dwight Kessler stood farther off, beside the dark-windowed sedan, checking his watch. He did not look at the old woman. He had learned long ago that on mornings like this one, not looking is the most essential professional skill. Beyond the fence, a knot of people had gathered, old neighbors, faces from town, a few of the merely curious. Lorraine Petty stood among them. She had driven through the night from Nashville when word of the enforcement date reached her, and now she stood there, arms hugging her coat to her chest, and when Opal went down in the dirt, Lorraine turned her face away. No one crossed the fence. Crossing the fence, in that moment, would have meant admitting that one could have done something years earlier, and no one had courage enough for that admission. Someone whispered that it was a shame. Someone else answered that nothing could be done. Then the sound of rotors swallowed everything. The helicopter made one low circle over the farm and set down in the western field, flattening a swath of young corn, blasting dust over boots and uniforms without regard for rank. Papers on a truck hood scattered. Somebody swore. The engine wound down, the blades slowed, and silence dropped over the whole yard, a silence heavy as quarried stone. The cabin door opened. The man who stepped down was somewhere past 40, dark jacket, no tie, moving with the unhurried gait of a man who does not rush because everything will wait for him. Behind him came a blonde woman clutching a thick file case. The man stopped at the edge of the yard, and his eyes traveled once across the scene, slowly, registering each item in turn. The 2 trucks, the belongings of an entire life strewn across the dirt, the cracked picture frame lying face down, and the white-haired woman kneeling by the pump. His jaw locked. Those standing closest would say afterward that they saw the man sway for half a second, like a man taking a punch, before he stood straight again. "What is going on here?" His voice was not loud, but it was the kind of voice that gets answered. Dwight Kessler recovered first, because his bureaucrat's instincts recognized the smell of high-altitude trouble. "This is an enforcement action of Warren County," he said, taking a step forward. "Court-ordered, land use violations, and you are, and that aircraft parked on an active site." The man did not stay for the end of the sentence. He walked past Kessler as one walks past a fence post, crossed the yard, and reaching the old woman, he went down on one knee to her level, keeping a small distance, not touching her, in the manner of a man who knows that a person who is breaking should not be grabbed hold of. "Ma'am," he said, softly enough that only she could hear. "What is your name?" She raised her head. A face streaked with dirt and tears, eyes with no strength left in them for curiosity, took in the stranger before her. "Opal," she said, her voice in gravel. "Opal Renner." The man closed his eyes for 1 full second. When he opened them, no witness could afterward describe exactly what had changed in that face, only that something had broken and mended in the same instant. He stood, turned toward the enforcement crew, and said exactly one word. "Stop." "You don't have the authority to give orders at," Kessler began. "I do." The man drew out his phone, but his eyes never left Kessler. "My name is Silas Crane, chairman of Crane Logistics. As of 9 o'clock Monday morning last week, my company signed a framework agreement to acquire the entire project portfolio of Meridian Freight Systems. This project included, which means every clearance action connected to it requires the buyer's approval. No one requested my approval. Second, the violations file underpinning this enforcement was red flagged by my due diligence team 3 days ago for irregularities. He tipped his head toward the blonde woman, who was already opening the file case. And third, my attorneys in Louisville filed an emergency motion to stay enforcement 40 minutes ago, while I was in the air. If you gentlemen wish to verify, call the county courthouse. I'll wait." Buck Trammell looked at Kessler. Kessler looked at his phone. The air in the yard thickened the way it does before a storm breaks. Then Silas turned his back on all of them, as if they had ceased to exist, and walked to the old woman. He knelt again, and this time, the whole bearing of a corporate chairman slid off him like a coat slipping from a shoulder. "Ma'am," he said, "it's Silas. It's your Silas." The name did not reach her at once. Opal blinked at him, through dust, through tears, through the pain in both knees. Silas was a memory. Silas was a rail-thin boy eating beans on a porch, a cough in a January night, 2 trembling arms gripping her shoulders on the morning of the black car. Silas was not this man in an expensive jacket with a helicopter cooling on the field behind him. And then he did something that no corporate chairman on this earth does in the middle of an enforcement scene. He took out his wallet, removed the worn paper folded in 4, opened it with both hands, carefully, the way one opens a page of scripture, and held it up for her to see her own slanted handwriting, set down 20 years before. Opal Renner, end of Pemberton Ridge Road, Warren County, Kentucky. "You said it was just in case," he said. His voice broke clean in half on the last word. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry the case took this long." Opal's hands began to shake. She reached out and touched the paper with fingers still caked in dirt, then abandoned the paper and touched his wrist, his forearm, the way the blind read a face. And then she could not speak at all. What came out of her was not made of words. Silas helped her to her feet, the grip far steadier than she expected, and walked her step by slow step across the yard, past the heaped furniture, up to the porch steps. The same porch, the same step. The place where 22 years earlier, a farm woman had set down before a starving boy a tin plate of beans and cornbread. Beyond the fence, no one said anything at all. Lorraine Petty stood with 2 lines of tears running down her face, and she did not bother wiping them, because she knew they could not wash what needed washing. What happened over the next 2 hours was not loud. It proceeded methodically, and it was precisely the methodicalness that made guilty men flinch. Silas raised his voice at no one. He sat on the porch step beside Opal. He refused to leave her side. Whatever needed bringing was brought to him. And with Colette Barr, he turned the file page by page on a tablet, as calmly as a farmer going over the books at season's end. Structural Inspection Report dated March 14th. he read aloud, clearly enough for Deputy Trammell, standing nearby, to catch every word. The Warren County office was closed that day. Snowstorm. The notice is still archived on the county website. Report dated June 22nd, signed by Chief Engineer Raymond Ott, who, according to public personnel records, retired and moved to Florida in April. How did Mr. Ott sign this report, Mr. Kessler? By mail, perhaps? Kessler stood 5 paces off, and careful observers noticed he was standing straighter by the minute, the straightness of a man spending everything he has on not falling over. And the entire legal basis for this enforcement, Silas said, turning the final page, rests on Zoning Amendment 7C. He looked up, and for the first time since stepping off the helicopter, he looked at Dwight Kessler long enough to count as looking. Amendment 7C has never been brought to a county commission vote. It is a proposal, drafted, initialed, and submitted by your own office. You evicted a 72-year-old woman from her home on the strength of a document you wrote yourself, which no one has ever approved. There is clearly some confusion regarding, Kessler began. There is, Silas said, and it is criminal. Deputy Buck Trammell looked down at the enforcement order in his hands, the sheaf of paper that 2 hours earlier had been the embodiment of the law, and had now grown heavy as something unclean. He folded it closed, and when he spoke, his voice, for the first time that day, belonged to a human being. Mrs. Renner, on behalf of the Warren County Sheriff's Office, we are suspending this action, effective immediately, pending verification. Then he turned to his crew and ground out each word. Carry it all back in. Put everything back exactly where it was. The table faces the way it faced. Anybody chips one more thing, it comes out of your own pay. They carried it all back in. A young crewman picked the cracked picture frame up off the dirt, wiped the dust away with his own sleeve, and brought it to Opal with both hands, eyes down, unable to look at her. She took it, laid it on her lap, and her hand rested on Harlan's face behind the fractured glass for a long, long moment. Before Dwight Kessler could retreat to the dark-windowed sedan, Silas rose from the porch step and crossed the yard to stand in his path. Not aggressively, he simply stood there, arms at his sides. On the flight down, I had my people pull your history, Silas said, his voice level. Dwight Kessler, raised on the Kessler farm, Old Millbrook Road. I know how that farm ended. I know how your father died. Kessler went rigid. In 20 years of public service, no one had ever spoken to him about Millbrook Road. So I won't ask you why you did it. I can guess, Silas went on. I'll only ask you one thing. The day they came to take your mother's last house, if you had found out that day that somebody had forged the paperwork to move it all along faster, to spare your mother the suffering of hope. He let one beat pass. Would you have shaken that man's hand and thanked him? Dwight Kessler opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. No sound came out. Because both men standing there already knew the answer, and only one of them would have to carry it home, set it on the dinner table, and live with it through every remaining supper of his life. Silas nodded once, as if confirming something now finished, and turned back toward the porch. The reckoning arrived over the following weeks, quiet and total in the manner of legal machinery that is paid what it is worth. Independent auditors re-examined every zoning file the county had produced in 5 years. The consultancy fee money trail was run down to the shell company at its end. Dwight Kessler was indicted along with 2 officials from the planning office. He pleaded guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony pulled down 3 more dirty Meridian deals in 2 neighboring counties. Meridian itself, already weakened, already bled white, collapsed outright under the weight of the scandal, and the Crane Logistics acquisition closed at a price even lower than projected, carrying one clause on its very first page, drafted personally by the chairman and marked non-negotiable. Parcel 17B, together with the entire agricultural belt, shall be transferred into a permanent farmland conservation trust in the name of Opal Renner, exempt in perpetuity from all future industrial zoning. The transfer hub was redesigned. Its main road bent northward around the farm. The engineers grumbled for 2 weeks. No one grumbled a third. Silas came back often. He never announced himself, and he never came by helicopter again. He drove a pickup truck bought off the lot right in Bowling Green, and he showed up in work clothes, boots muddy, sleeves rolled, as though the past 20 years had merely been one growing season that ran longer than usual. New equipment arrived first, then drip irrigation, then the barn roof, raised straight and true again, then hired hands, recruited from the very town that had once turned its face away. But there are things no purchase order can bring back. One late afternoon, Opal found Silas standing a long time at the corner of the yard, beside the barn, the place where the pecan tree used to stand. Meridian's survey crew had cut it down the year before to clear a line for their measuring trucks. All that remained was a stump the height of a milking stool. Beneath that stump lay the bones of the dog, Biscuit. Silas stood there, hands in his pockets, saying nothing. Opal came out and stood beside him, also saying nothing. There are losses that an apology only diminishes, unjustly. 20 years, he said at last, eyes still on the stump. At first, it was my grandfather stopping the letters. I knew you weren't getting them, and I had no way to. But later on, it wasn't him anymore, ma'am. Later on, it was me. I kept waiting until I was rich enough to come back worthy. Every year I told myself not yet, a little longer. He laughed, one note with nothing in it. I was a fool. You never needed me rich. No, Opal said. I only needed to know you were alive and living decent. And instead I let you go down on your knees in the dirt before I found out. She was silent for a long while. The evening wind moved through the corn, carrying the smell of earth after rain, the smell of strong dirt. Then she said the sentence that Silas Crane would carry for the rest of his life. You came late, yes, but you came on the one day when, if you hadn't come, every other day I had left would have lost its meaning. A life isn't measured by whether we arrive early or late, Silas. It's measured by whether we arrive at all. That autumn, the two of them planted a young pecan tree 3 paces from the old stump. This kind grows slow, Silas said, tamping the earth around its base. Planting a pecan is planting for 20 years from now. Opal looked at him, and both of them heard the echo of that sentence from 22 years before, and neither of them said another word. Some sentences only need to be planted. They do not need watering with talk.
Lorraine Petty came one morning and stood at the gate with a jar of strawberry preserves in her hands, not daring to come in. She had been standing there nearly 10 minutes when Opal noticed her through the kitchen window. Opal could have left her old friend standing there. She had earned that right, and both women knew it. Instead, she opened the door and called out exactly one sentence. "Come on in, water's just boiled." Some forgiveness requires no speeches. It requires only a kettle boiling at the right moment and one person large enough not to make the other say all the things that are hard to say. Silas asked her to come live with his family in Chicago. She declined the first time. He asked a second time. She declined again. "You can't transplant an old tree, child." On the third asking, the two of them met in the middle. Every winter, when the land rested, she would go up and stay with him, his wife, and their two small children for a few months. Two children who called her Grandma Opal and fought over who got to hear the story of their father as a boy hiding from chores and getting stung by bees. He did not argue about the remaining months of the year. He adjusted. It was the thing she had taught him since he was 10 years old. Listen more than you speak, and put the person before the argument. On a clear autumn morning, Opal stood at the edge of the field, watching the earth turn over under the new plow blade, black and damp and alive. She pressed her palms together and felt the machine's low vibration travel through the ground, through the air, all the way up her arms. Silas stood beside her, silent, a streak of engine grease on the shoulder of his shirt. "You kept your word," she said. "I just showed up late." She shook her head and said nothing more. There are arguments in which losing is the victory. That evening, after Silas's pickup disappeared around the bend, Opal made her circuit of the house, the habit of a lifetime. Checked the barn door latch, turned the bucket upside down beside the pump, and passing the stove, she stopped. The old shoes were still there, the stitched sole shoes, 20 years waiting for their owner to come back for them. Silas had seen them on his very first day back, and she had watched him stand before them, motionless, for a long time. He had not taken them away. He had done just one thing: set down beside them a pair of his own new work boots, a grown man's size, the leather still stiff, the soles still carrying mud from this very farm, and left them there as a promise for the next return, and the one after that, and every one after that. 2 pairs of shoes, one old and one new, side by side beside the stove. Opal looked at them for a while. Then she turned off the kitchen light, went to her room, and for the first time in many, many years, she did not lock the door. The house breathed evenly in the dark. Outside, the land rested, and at the corner of the yard, a young pecan tree was beginning its 20-year work. As for me, whenever I think back on this story, I find that I do not think about the helicopter. What stays with me is the piece of paper folded in 4 inside a wallet, paper worn soft as silk, not because it was forgotten, but because it was opened thousands of times by a man who did not dare go home. It turns out that what keeps a promise alive for 20 years is not money and not memory. It is creases worn into white thread. It is a pair of old shoes that the one who stayed behind could never bring herself to put away. A person can arrive late to almost everything in this world, to a career, to acclaim, even to the wealth we imagine is the precondition of gratitude. Only, do not arrive late to the person who still keeps an empty place for you beside the stove. Because the land can always wait for another season. People cannot always wait.